Ambassador Palouche, John Suarez.
Thank you. Listening to Ambassador Palouche, I also see many things are reflected in the Cuban example and also with Professor Spaulding. In the case of Cuba, there were some critical differences. We had a revolution against the dictator that portrayed itself publicly to Cubans as a democratic Jeffersonian revolution, but you had a group of conspirators that from the earliest days of their gatherings were already plotting a communist takeover of Cuba with Soviet KGB agents. So towards the end of 1959, some of the members of that process that were not in on the secret because they were anti-communist suddenly became dissidents. One of them was Uber Matos, who was a commandant of the revolution. He had taken a critical role in providing arms to overthrow Mr. Batista, but he saw that communists were joining the ranks of this new revolutionary government. And on 3 occasions, he attempted to resign, but those letters of resignation were rejected by Fidel Castro until finally Fidel Castro had him arrested and accused of treason and made the letters public, and had a messenger sent to Mr. Matos offering that nothing would happen to him if he confessed everything at the show trial that they were arranging for him. Mr. Matos rejected the offer, and he went to the military trial that was still early enough that there was some space to speak out. And his presentation shifted the opinion of a number of the military officers in the room who stood up and applauded his courage. The Castro brothers had planned to have him summarily executed. Instead, they sentenced him to 20 years in prison. And I'm going with this example of dissent because that was early on. A number of his compatriots went back up into the hills and had an armed resistance. And they were met with the Revolutionary Cuban Army backed with Soviet counterinsurgency advisors, and over the space of 6 years wiped out in the Escambray. But parallel to that, we had the dissidents more in the hovel model emerging in Cuba. Another one was Jorge Laos, who was a poet. He had been also in opposition to the Batista regime, suffered in prison and exile during the 1950s. He was approached by Fidel Castro while still in prison during the Batista years to join him in Mexico, but he already recognized that he found Fidel Castro to be an immoral person and rejected the offer. And when the revolution arrived, initially he was going to be joining a seminary. And while he was on his way to the seminary, he heard that a friend of his was being put on a political show trial. And instead he decided to go and speak on behalf of his friend at the political show trial, and was sentenced to 20 years in prison for doing that. While in prison, he read and smuggled poems, taught others how to write, how to read, organized teach-ins, wrote poetry. I'm going to give you a small excerpt. Where I am, there is no light, and it is barred. Just beyond there lies a light in space. Therefore, light must exist. He emerged from prison. He served the 20 years, and the prison commissars tacked on an additional 40 days for his lack of cooperation and being indoctrinated. He was a Cuban Stoic, and that is reflected in a quote 2 years later in the New York Times, where he said, "The only thing that can give you joy and pain is what happens inside you, not outside you." Another dissident, Ricardo Bofill, co-founder of the Cuban Committee for Human Rights in 1976, inspired by the Helsinki Accords, dedicated his entire life to human rights and suffered years in Cuban prisons for defending them. In the 1987 documentary, which is online, Nobody Listened, Nadie Escuchaba, with English subtitles, directed by Nestor Almendros and Jorge Ulla, we're introduced to Dr. Bofill in the streets of Havana. And he describes about the circumstances that a dissident faces for speaking out in this battle of ideas, saying, "I can't understand the hatred towards me, because really, in the only field I've done battle, it's the field of ideas. This field I've had no response, just prison and the police. And I don't know why, because revolution controls all mass media. They have editorials, journalists, even many writers in the world. I don't know why the response time and time again has been jail. The response should come in the field I fight with ideas." Another, that this committee was able to gather reports of human rights abuses, and then thanks to Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, the emergence of Reagan and TPRP, people were inside of the island, got to know who the committee was, and also delivered their reports. And thanks to, again, the Reagan administration, Armando Valladares, a former political prisoner who was made ambassador to the UN, they were able to battle at the UN and get resolutions year after year after year, condemning the human rights record of the Castro regime, thanks to Ricardo Bofill. 1988, Osvaldo Payá Sardinhas founds the Christian Liberation Movement. During the 24 years that he carried out his activism, he was able to achieve a singular objective. Over 25,000 Cubans signed something called the Barella Project, which sought the regime to reform itself and respect human rights. The regime's response was to declare the Constitution unchangeable, round up the organizers of the project, sentencing them anywhere from 15 to 28 years in prison. And Osvaldo Payá was murdered on July 22nd of 2012, which will be marking 9 years in just a couple of days. But I think it's important to listen to him. He was killed by the secret police, but again, as Ricardo Bofill said, these were ideas. The first victory we can claim is that our hearts are free of hatred. Hence, we say to those who persecute us and who try to dominate us, you are my brother, I do not hate you, but you are not going to dominate me by fear. I do not wish to impose my truth, nor do I wish you to impose yours on me. We are going to seek the truth together. Another case, Lara Poyan. When those activists were rounded up in 2003, the wives, sisters, daughters, mothers organized a movement called the Ladies in White. Laura, prior to her husband's arrest, was an apolitical high school literature teacher who loved cats and plants. That all changed when her husband, Hector Maceda Gutierrez, an independent journalist, was unjustly sentenced to 20 years in prison. She carried out protests with these women day after day for years, and by 2011 got all those loved ones out of prison. But she insisted that as long as the system did not reform itself, they would continue marching in the streets. Months later, she died under the custody of the secret police at a hospital after a sudden illness. And finally, and that was October 14th of 2011, which we will be observing the 10-year anniversary. The San Isidro movement, a dissident movement made up of artists that came into existence in 2018 to protest Decree 349. The headquarters were at Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara's home. They again, for the last 3 years, have been consistently protesting, demonstrating, and demanding that artistic freedom of expression be respected in Cuba. This past November 27th, after his home, the headquarters of San Isidro had been raided, hundreds of artists took to the streets in front of the Ministry of Culture, demanding freedom of expression, artistic expression in Cuba. Luis Manuel participated in the creation of a song which has become a rallying cry in these protests in Cuba over the last few days, called Patria y Vida, Homeland and Life, with other artists inside and outside of Cuba. I just wish to conclude, because I am out of time, that what these dissidents have in common is an embrace of truth, persistence, and courage to speak that truth in the worst of places. And that is what terrifies these type of regimes. Combined with international solidarity and support, as we saw in the 1980s, those regimes can be brought down non-violently and peacefully. But it requires not just those brave few souls and the movements that they inspired inside of the island, but international solidarity and multilateral cooperation among democratic states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.